I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters, and there's nothing, absolutely nothing else like it. I write every episode myself. My voice is the only one you'll hear. I do a new episode every week, and they're all done in one single, flawless take. The show is serialized, but you don't need to worry about going back to start at the beginning. Instead, just dive in here with the best episode of the show yet. Once you're hooked, go back and listen to the previous episodes at your leisure, or pick up the prose volumes available exclusively on Amazon. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 89. Ravenah was in the throes of chaos, overcome with pandemonium, held in the firm grasp of that skeletal hand of discord, the one that dug its poison-tipped nails into the city's cracking foundations and shook. The city was coming apart at the seams, the ones that ruptured and tore at the urging of an incessant, primal, terrifying beat. And the people within those crumbling walls, they also were seized by panic, overwhelmed by fear, overcome by emotions they could not parse or understand. The crowds milled about and they smashed into one another. There were too many of them. There were far too many of them. Far too many souls held in that pen. Like calves prepared for the slaughter, they had been corralled there. They had been driven from their homes, from their businesses, from their safe havens in Ravenah's outer reaches, from the farms and the mills that supported that city's growth, from even areas that until recently had been considered central. Ravenah had been considered a part of that once great city-state before they had been overtaken by the wilderness. Before they had been assaulted by the centaurs, by that convulsing horde, before those insufficient walls had been toppled, before they had tumbled down into dust, into dirt, out of which sprang the wild flowers and the weeds of the growing fields that had followed, inevitably, just behind the frothing waves of that centaur horde. The citizens of Ravenah, of Ravenah's fallen arrondissements, those that had survived, those unlucky enough to still draw breath into their fear-stricken lungs, they had retreated, they had fled, they had run in the only direction open to them. They had run from the centaur horde, and they had forced their way into the increasingly crowded center of their dying city. But now, they were cornered. Now, they had nowhere else to run, no other walls to hide behind, no one to appeal to for safety and protection and succor. The refugees slept on cobblestones, and they huddled under doorways. They filled abandoned buildings and constructed makeshift shelters for themselves, but mostly they feared and they wept because they had seen what the horde could do. They had seen Ravenah's defenses falter and fail, and they saw no reason to hope for their salvation. At least, they hadn't before she came, before she arose, before she drew forth from Ravenah's very walls, from its foundations, before she sprang out of their hearts and their tears, a towering, gleaming demigod, draped in supple suede, there to perform her dance of safety, meant to inspire and protect them, to safeguard her city. Their fears had been quelled. Their terror had abated. Their horror gave way to hope as they watched that spectral dance, watched her pull mass and form into herself, watched her compel the universe to acknowledge her presence, to make herself corporeal, standing proudly in front of Ravenah's walls, the city's real walls, its original walls. The people had always followed, they had always loved the Lady of Ravenah, but until then, they did not know who she truly was. They did not know that they had revered an imposter, a pretender to that great, proud name. But now, they knew. They knew, not just in their minds, but in their hearts, in their quaking souls. They knew that it was she who had birthed their city, who had protected them all those years, all of their lives, and that it was she who would protect them once again, who would drive that riotous horde away, would cast them back into the savage, truculent wilds in which they belonged. And so, as they felt her constitute herself in the real world, in their world, in the world of smoke and shadows, they felt drawn to gaze upon her, to look upon her glory, so that they might better rejoice, that they might more easily sing her praises, to get a better view, to better observe her wild, twisting dance of protection, of safety. They had ascended, they had scaled the walls, they mounted the ramparts, they looked out through parapets and battlements, and they sang out her name, a name of glory and of power and of security that was so magnificent, so splendid, so numinous that their mortal brains could not hold on to it for long. As soon as it left their lips, it was gone. But though the word itself was lost, its power could never be forgotten. They watched her. They watched their demigod, their savior, watched her cut down the centaur horde, watched her fell them with her joyous, spinning dance, watched her braids slice into the hard, leathery horseflesh of those vicious savages, watched them crumple to the ground where her nimble feet pounded out a song that silenced the horde's primal rhythm. They had been saved, and so they sang, and they rejoiced. Yes, their homes had been lost. Their friends, their families had fallen. But they had found salvation. They had found protection, and they would endure. Their city would endure. Her city would endure. Ravenah would survive. The ramparts crowded with souls eager to gaze upon that forgotten demigod, to partake of the cleansing effects that her very presence imparted upon the faithful. They began to whip themselves into a joyous, religious fervor. But before the ecstasy could fully take hold, the foundation it was built upon, the very ground that their demigod, the forgotten woman, the Lady of Ravenah, danced upon, it crumbled. To the untrained eye, it would have appeared that it was her very dancing that shattered the earth beneath her, that it was those irresistible, tireless footfalls that caused the ground to crack and to splinter. But the faithful, they knew different. They knew better, because they could see that her dance had been disturbed, had been interrupted, had been tarnished by what tore up from the earth beneath her feet. Ripping up from below, from the sewers, from the foul tunnels that ran beneath Ravenah, that hearkened back to some earlier, darker time, best forgotten, best discarded, best left in the past. There was a terrifying creation, something impossible, something that could not and should not be. Something made of deadened materials, of lifeless steel, and of creaking gears. Something that belched steam and screeched out blasphemies, noises that were an affront to all honest creation. Though they had never seen such a thing, though they could have never dreamed of one, not even in their nightmares, the faithful knew it for what it truly was. Their doom. And they watched as those swiping blades and those spinning drills went to work. Watched as those monstrous legs burst out of the ground and began to pull that monstrosity to the surface. Watched as it flung itself into the fray, slaughtering all that it came across. They watched it. That terrible machine, the cataclysmaton. They watched as it butchered the centaurs with a speed, with a mindless efficiency that put their demigod to shame. And they watched as the cataclysmaton, expressing no preference for what it killed, for what it laid low, for what souls it turned into bloody meat. They watched as their demigod, the forgotten woman, also fell prey to its rigid, mechanical advance. Her dancing could not evade it. Her braids could not deter it. Its blades continued swinging. Its drills continued whirring. Its gears and its cogs continued to clank and grind unnaturally, abhorrently. The faithful watched as the Lady of Ravenah did her best to protect them, did her best to shield them, not only from the ravages of nature, but from the perversions of science, the unholy worship of technology and progress. They watched as she failed utterly, with a heartbreaking cry upon her lips. They watched for as long as they could, until the utter dismay was too much for their aching hearts to bear. The faithful, packed onto those narrow ramparts, crowded onto balconies high above the city, they turned away from the horrors just outside their walls. They turned away from their demigod, turned away from the Lady of Ravenah in the time of her most acute, most terrible suffering, turned away at her lowest moment. And they looked back, looked away from the battle, looked back toward the center of the city. They looked out into the expanse of empty air that surrounded those towering, cyclopean, shaking walls. They looked out into the void. And as they did, as their last hope at safety, at protection, at security, died screaming and crying behind them, died shedding tears that fell upon lifeless gears, wept tears that would not give rise to anything but blasted earth and ruined landscapes. Their hearts, previously full of hope and joy and splendid magnificence, they were overtaken by hopelessness. With no hope in their hearts, with the Lady of Ravenah's death rattle filling their ears, with that terrible machine crawling up from the depths, the people of Ravenah, the survivors, the true believers that had crowded the ramparts together, the better to sing out the praises of their now fallen savior. They did the only thing they could do, the only thing that made sense to their broken minds, the only thing that made sense in that fallen world. Flung themselves into the abyss. Men and women alike hurled themselves off the ramparts. Lovers held hands as they leapt. Parents helped children too young to understand the grisly fate that awaited them. The sane and the mad alike jumped from the parapets. They took a running leap out into the abyss, knowing that the quick, sudden impact, that a decisive entry into the inky black void of nothingness was better than any kind of life that could be left for them, any kind of life they could carve out for themselves in the absence of their savior. Because even if the centaurs were beaten back, even if that hideous engine of destruction's grisly hungers were satisfied, how could they willingly live in the darkness after having been bathed in that bright, glorious light? The faithful hurtled down from the heavens, howling and weeping as they plummeted through the air. Their flailing limbs blocked out the dual suns of that border realm. Their crashing forms broke through tiled and pitched roofs. Their pitiful, pitiable bodies, broken long before they smashed into the ground, they rained down like horrible, screeching hailstones. And it was amidst that grisly downpour, that torrent of suicides, those that wished their bodies to become as irrevocably shattered as their souls, it was amongst that deluge of corpses that the one true king of men stepped up on to the surface. Maul stood proudly upon the earth, looking with disdain on the crumpled, broken bodies around him. Cowards, a lot of them, craven fools without the constitution to fix what was broken within them, without the will to take what they needed, to seize what they deserved, to put their hands upon whatever it was that had been denied them. Maul snorted, heedless the danger as bodies crashed down all around him, and then he let out a chuckle, laughing at the grim realization that men that craven, they were better off dead. But though Maul had climbed up out of those sewers alone, though he was by himself when he first planted his feet upon the shattered and shattering cobblestones of Ravenah, of what was left of Ravenah, he was soon joined by others. He was joined by the vermin prince, by that conniving, filthy, self-proclaimed regent. He was joined by the vermin prince's followers, by his mutated warriors and his cringing sycophants. And he was joined by one other, too. He was joined by the green-eyed old man who Maul had demanded to have accompany him, the vermin prince's former teacher, Master Ho. But while the falling bodies of the condemned, of the forsaken, of the cowardly, while they seemed to avoid Maul, as if, even in the moments of their death, they knew that one such as him was not to be trifled with, while the falling, broken bodies fell all around the one true king of flames and ashes, the rest of Maul's party was not so lucky. The bodies fell quick, and they fell hard, and the vermin prince, with only one good leg, found himself directly in their path. He would have been crushed, battered to the ground, and broken by those falling bodies. He should have been crushed, not for the quick action of his soldiers, of his militant warriors, those who had been twisted and perverted by his foul magics. They threw themselves in the plummeting bodies' paths. They shielded their leader with their own gnarled and mutated bodies. They sacrificed themselves for his safety. And those that weren't struck down and killed by those falling bodies, those that still drew breath and saw their leader, their prince, standing out in the perilous open, they lifted him up. They hoisted him to their bony, slimy shoulders, and they carried him quickly to safety, carried him away from the walls, carried him deeper into the city where even the most eager suicides could not reach them with their deadly falls. They spirited the vermin prince away, following in the confident, brash footsteps of the destroyer and the shifting, erratic path of Master Ho, who swayed and stumbled his way through that deadly downpour. Once away from the walls, their party was no longer subject to falling bodies, was no longer required to dodge out of the way of howling suicides, but the streets of Ravenah were no less perilous. Driven mad by their city's impending fall, driven wild by the presence of such savagery at their gates, driven to distraction by the utter failure of their ladies, both their real and imagined ones. The city's citizens had broken out in riots, and Maul, he loved it. He loved the mayhem. He loved the flames and the ashes that surrounded him, the flames and the ashes that were his origins and his destiny. He loved the hot iron scent of blood in the air as Ravenah's citizens turned against one another, and he loved the chaos that allowed his party, that disgusting, unnatural group of warriors, the ones who prowled through the streets with ill intentions clouding their eyes. He loved that they could do so unmolested. But most of all, he loved knowing that this city, the city that had been both goal and prison to him, the city that had embodied all that was foul in man and mankind, all that was worthy of derision in civilization and its excesses. He loved knowing that the city of Ravenah was falling, that the site of his banishment, the place where he was condemned to unimaginable suffering, suffering the likes of which even he, who was born and molded in agony, had never experienced. He rejoiced at the knowledge that it was Ravenah that would soon be cast down where it belonged, into the dust. Maul stomped through those chaotic streets, and he reveled in the destruction that raged all around him. Ravenah was falling, and he was delighted. The witch, Caleria, still held the city, but not for long. And with the chaos that had gripped Ravenah, her and her proctor's control was tenuous at best. And the proctors, those that remained, those that hadn't been sent out to die on the front, sent out in a futile effort to halt the centaurs' advances. They were far too busy putting out fires, both literal and figurative, to even notice Maul, to notice the king in their presence, to notice the path that he and his deadly retinue marched upon, heading directly toward Caleria's decrepit tower at the center of that city. Maul made his way quickly through Ravenah's chaotic streets, leaving his gruesome party behind. He ran at a full sprint and was rarely challenged. In fact, Maul, clutching his instruments of destruction, that cudgel and his horn, he was disappointed that he did not face more opposition, that he didn't have more of an opportunity to rain down hellfire upon anyone brave enough, anyone stupid enough, anyone unfortunate enough to stand in his way. So when he was opposed, when he finally did face opposition, when his way into Caleria's tower was blocked by a pair of terrified proctors, Maul was thrilled. He launched himself at them, growling like the animal he was, swinging both hands wildly as his woad blue runes shifted and fought with one another just beneath his skin. His bloodlust was so acute, his rage so overpowering, that he felled the two proctors immediately. One with a bludgeoning blow to the head, and the other with a piercing strike to the heart. The fight was over before it had begun. Maul hadn't broken a sweat, and he regretted not savoring the battle. But what was done was, as ever, done. And Maul's goal, Maul's destiny, stretched out before him. The tower rose up before him, though it was smaller, shorter than he had remembered. It had fallen. It had crumbled. It had sunk beneath the earth as Ravenah's borders contracted. And now It was so diminished that it was barely even a tower, more just a building, barely taller than any of those that surrounded it. All bounded up the stairs, having long ago left the vermin prince, his followers, and that green-eyed old man in his wake. Left them in the streets, in the alleys. He did not know, and he did not care, because they were not necessary. They were useless. He didn't need them to defeat the witch Caleria. No, all he needed was his cudgel, that blackened, notched, and bloody branch of the world tree. It was all he needed to beat her to the ground, to beat the breath out of her, to teach her the meaning of suffering, to watch her plead, weep, and die as he himself had begged to do while suffering the torture that she had condemned him to. He bounded up the stairs, one flight after another, skipping one, skipping two, skipping 3 stairs at a time. He flew up the stairs, panting, not from exhaustion, but from excitement, from anticipation. He slid his horn, that long, twisting, alabaster horn, deep within the filthy rags he wore, the same rags that had clothed him throughout his time in the roiling underneath. And taking up his cudgel in both hands, he kicked the door, kicked down the first door that he could see, the heavy stone door with no handle. He kicked it again and again. He kicked that door, the one barred and secured with magics Mole could not and did not want to comprehend. The magics that, though they could repel an army, could not stand against the all-consuming fire of Mole's rage, of his hatred and his anger. And with one final kick, the door fell inward. Mole stomped into that red-lit room, the one with smoldering braziers in each corner, and standing in front of a blackened altar. He saw her. Though she was ancient, though she was covered in more wrinkles than skin, though her once vibrant hair had gone brittle and thin, there was no mistaking the fire, the cathartic flame that filled both her eyes, and the massive pearl atop her staff. She stood there, waiting in the darkness, clutching that long, blackened spear, the one festooned with glowing red veins. She had been ready to attack, ready to slaughter whatever came through that door. But when she looked upon that invader, when she looked upon the destroyer, Mole, she gasped. You, she stuttered. I banished you. How? Mole advanced slowly. A deep, troubling noise, part growl and part laugh, bubbling up within his chest. He licked his lips, and he began to swing his cudgel, fantasizing about the aftershocks he'd feel running up his arms as he cracked the witch's skull. Caleria took a bolder stance, a defensive stance, and she raised the spear. You're here to kill me, then? Mole's lips turned upward into a cruel, sardonic, rictus grin, and he spoke with a voice like a blazing forest. Yes, but put up a fight. I want to savor this. Thanks for listening to this, the very best episode of SKALD yet. The trick, as always, is letting people know about this, the only story that matters. And the best way? It's super easy. It's iTunes reviews. Reviews on iTunes and other podcasting platforms are crucial to this show's growth. So please, take a few minutes and write one today. They don't even need to be long. Check out this 5-star review from Cub Fan JM. Flawless indeed. What a storyteller. Unbelievable delivery. Reviews are the best way to help get the word out, but I also need your support on social media. Every Tuesday, when a new episode of SKALD hits your podcast feeds, please take to Twitter, to Facebook, to Tumblr, to Snapchat, to wherever you like to yammer out into the abyss, and please inform the sucking void of your undying love for the only story that matters. I'm Aubrey Sitterson on all platforms, and if you tag me, I will always shamelessly share your posts. And if you truly dig SKALD, if you'd be bummed if one day I'd either slow down its frenetic pace or even wind the show down completely, you have to get to patreon.com/SKALD. I know that SKALD is as good as any podcast, any comic book, any television show or movie. I know it, and you know it. Isn't it worth a few bucks a month then? Head to patreon.com/SKALD today to throw a few bucks into the hat. For more information on me, the SKALD prose volumes, my comic book writing, signed copies of my work, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, my bio, contact information, social media, and more, head to aubreysitterson.com. It's got links to everything. Finally, my weekly recommendation. So, it's definitely not good background music. I tried to write SKALD to it, and it was a terrible idea. Because it's just too fast and too fun. It's the newest from thrash metal legends Testament. Of the big 1980s thrash bands, Testament has aged the absolute best. And this latest album, Brotherhood of the Snake, perfectly exemplifies what makes them so amazing. It's full of tasty riffs, rad breakdowns, and vocals that clearly communicate what a blast they're having. It's on Spotify, and it's more than worthy of your time. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.